Okay.
Можете починати, окей.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to the fourth round of the conversations between Professor Rajan Menon and myself, Alexander Мотилем. I don't know if we're back by popular demand, but we're certainly back. Thanks, of course, to the Ukrainian Free University, which is sponsoring and organizing this event. And we are, of course, grateful to the Ukrainian Free University and its rector, Dr. Maria Prishlak, for supporting this idea and for promoting it amongst its many students and supporters in Europe, Ukraine, as well as in North America. We have a very exciting program for today. We will talk about an issue that Professor Menon raised at the very end of our last conversation, and that was the possibility that Ukraine would have been more secure had it still possessed nuclear weapons. We'll talk about that. I promise we'll get to that, but we'll talk about that at the end of our conversation, for the simple reason that, as you know from the announcement, the focus of this roundtable will be Professor Menon's trip to Ukraine, August 15 through 25, more or less. And he saw many things, he went to many places. And I'd like to start by asking him just to give us a brief overview of how you got there, where you went, what you saw, whom you met. And then we'll talk more about substantive issues regarding the war, the peace, the population, the society. Raj, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all very much for coming. When Alex and I began this, I think this is the fourth one. I always wondered after the first one, would anybody show up? But people have been showing up, so I'm very grateful. Thank you also to Professor Prishlak. You'll see behind Alex a painting that he has done about the destructiveness of the war in Ukraine. I've seen many of these paintings, and they're absolutely wonderful. So if you want to buy any, just write him. I think they're absolutely stunning as a piece of art, but also a depiction of the horrors of war. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about why I made the trip, because a lot of people told me not to do it. They thought it was just too dangerous. The reason I did it was that I'm speaking to you from a village of about 100 people in the northeastern state of New Hampshire. And I'm surrounded by beauty and quiet. And I've been writing about and following the war in Ukraine as best as I can. I have to tell you that the more I follow it, sometimes I think the less I understand it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And at some point, I just felt uncomfortable writing about what was going on there without, in some sense, going there to just have a sense of what is happening, visually seeing it, and how people are managing in the course of a war that has been horrifically destructive. It felt kind of false or phony for me just to be sitting here and writing. I'm not saying that people who haven't done that are lesser people. I'm just telling you my own reason for doing it. I have a former student who's a Ukrainian American who's very close to the Zelensky government. And he arranged for me to connect with an American who's married to a Ukrainian who's lived in Ukraine for many years. And I don't know about his precise background, but at the moment, what he does is deliver relief supplies to places well beyond Kiev. And I wanted to go with him because I didn't want to be stuck in Kiev. It's a wonderful city. I've been to Ukraine multiple times, but I wanted to go out into as close as possible to where the war was taking place. So this is briefly my itinerary, or where I went, and then I'll tell you something about what I saw. I started in Kiev. I spent about 2 days there, but I went immediately to the north to places whose names all of you know all too well: Gostomel, Bucha, and Irpin. And you can hear about the destruction of these places and you can see the photography, but when you see it with your eyes, it is an entirely different thing. Coastal Mail has been basically just largely destroyed. The reports that the Ukrainians were lying when they said shopping centers were hit is absolutely not true, because I saw a shopping center that was hit, and it's very difficult for me to believe that it was a military target. Either the Russians have terrible intelligence or terribly bad rockets, because it's a very large structure, and to hit it accidentally, I think, is very, very difficult. You see also the really vile and venomous graffiti that Russian soldiers have scrawled on the walls. And there's one site that especially sticks in my mind. There's an apartment building, not a very tall one. And unlike the others, it's been largely undestroyed, except for one apartment window through which a shell went and probably killed everybody inside of it. So the atrocities that were committed in Irpin and Gostomel and Bucha, especially the graves that were later unearthed by Ukrainian forensic specialists. That is, these were people from Bucha who were told to dig graves. They thought they may be digging their own graves, but what they were doing was digging graves in which people who had been tortured and killed by Russian soldiers could be buried. So I did that. One of the things I learned from this particular visit, and some of you may know this, and maybe I just didn't know it, it is how close the Russians came to achieving their objective of changing, carrying out regime change, displacing President Zelensky's government. Because it's not that they just came to Bucha and so on, which are kind of on the outskirts of Kiev, it's about 20 kilometers. They actually came into the city very close to the presidential palace, and they had airdropped airborne troops and heliborne troops, which the Ukrainians were ready for and killed. So this was a very, very close run thing. So when we say that the northern offensive failed, it did fail because the Ukrainians repulsed it and forced the Russians to focus on the east and the south, where they are now, but it was very, very close. So from Kiev, and I'll stop in a second because I don't want to keep going on and telling you at great length about my travel schedule. I went to Kryvyi Rih, which, as you know, is the hometown of President Zelensky, but it's also not far from the front lines. And it's a highly protected town because if you come up north from Kherson, you can take Kryvyi Rih. And if they take it, it would be a big prize for them because of the symbolism of it being President Zelensky's home. We then made our way through roads. Incidentally, the roads, when you get close to the front, have craters in them that are about this big. And even if you drive 20 miles an hour and you drive into one of those craters, it will take the wheel of even a sturdy car right off. So you have these roads, and on the side, you have the Chernozem, the fields, with acres upon acres upon acres of sunflower seeds and so on. We go to Melitopol, and if you stand on the bank of the Dnipro, you can see the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with your naked eye. You can see it very, very clearly. And on a very clear day, I'm told you can see Russian troops, although I didn't see any.
You mean Nikopol? Nikopol.
Nikopol. I'm sorry. What did I say? I say
Melitopol.
I'm sorry, Nikopol. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, no, I didn't go to Melitopol. I wouldn't be back with you if I had been. Nikopol. So it's across the Dnieper. Nikopol. The first thing I noticed about Nikopol is that there was nobody around. We were there on a very nice day. The playgrounds were empty. Parks were empty. The shops were empty. Nobody seemed to be around. So we met a local businessman who took us around. And what he said was there's been a mass exodus from Nikopol, especially young people whose skills are needed, and even refugees, because the city has been shelled so often, left because they found it too dangerous, except for the refugees from parts of Ukraine that have been really badly destroyed. They had seen businesses have collapsed, and so on. I went to a children's hospital, and the doctor said, "Oh, you come from the United States, you must see much better hospitals." Well, I have to say, I've seen worse, and this one was pretty damn good. It was an incredibly clean hospital with paintings on the walls that were meant to reassure children that they were in a safe place. And I asked the doctor, how many of the doctors and nurses and other staff here have left? And he said, virtually no one. Now, what's amazing about this is these are people with skills who could have easily left, and gone to other parts of Ukraine, but they stayed there to take care of their kids. I don't know if I told you this, but I was on the bank of the Dnieper and looking over at Zaporozhye, and the friend who was accompanying me said, you have to come down immediately from there because you can get hit by an artillery shell just like that. That gives you a sense of how close Nikopol was. And it's a city that's been hit very often, including the day before I was there. I will say this, and this is not to pump up the greatness of my visit. The only time in 10 days when I was there when I did not experience at least one air raid or rocket alert siren was just one day. And I say this because this is the kind of atmosphere in which even people in Kiev live on a constant basis. Now think of yourself as a young child or the parent of a young child. How do you explain to a young child what this is all about when even the concept of war is very difficult to explain? So from Melitopol, which is kind of, by the way, not a very pretty town.
Nico.
I'm still recovering from jet lag, I think. From Nikopol, which is, by the way, not a very attractive town. It has various associations with gangsters and so on, but it was interesting to see. We went to Dnipro, which is another town that's been shelled, but not quite so often. It's been shelled because there's a military hospital there, and there are Soviet-era military industries that are still very active. What I saw in Dnipro was something that revealed another side of the war in Ukraine. There was a shelter for women run by young people who every day had to figure out how they would get all the supplies that were needed to take care of these people. Only women and children could stay there. The youngest resident was a baby that was 1 month old. What I learned about this place is that you can go there and you can stay for a week, but after that you have to leave because there's a constant flow of new, I said refugees, I should say internally displaced people. That is people in Ukraine who've been forced to move to other parts of Ukraine. So this is a really heroic operation. Here are these young people, they're really stressed out. They're constantly figuring out how they'll get blankets and soap and food. Local restaurants are chipping in. Again, these are bright young people, most of whom spoke perfect English. They could have easily have left. And so they stayed behind. So one of the lessons about a war is that on the one hand, it brings out the worst in people. Bucha, for instance. On the other hand, it brings out the best in people because there's a kind of a pulling together of Ukrainian society that is really quite remarkable. From Dnipro, I went on the outskirts of Donetsk, not into Donetsk. We were supposed to go to Kramatorsk. We didn't, but we stayed in Kremenchuk. 2 air raid alerts that night. No bunker to go to. And we wended our way up the Dnipro River to Cherkasy, to Kanyev, which, as you know, is the place where the Shevchenko Memorial is, and back to Kiev. A couple of things. There has been a lot of talk in the United States now that it's time for a political settlement. I did not meet a single person, whether journalist or government official or soldier, and I met some soldiers who were fighting on the front line, who wanted anything to do with a political settlement, and for very good reason. They said, what would be a political settlement now? It would basically lead to some form of partition of Ukraine. We can't do that because asking us to do that is to essentially saying you've got to sign over the land that the Russians used, the occupy. Now, in the end, I don't know how this war will end. Maybe there will be some forced settlement like that, but nobody in Ukraine is willing to do it. Second thing I learned is there is a fear here that over time, as the war goes on, the Russian military, which is this big, gigantic machine, will slowly just grind down Ukrainian resistance. Maybe that will happen. But I asked various Ukrainians, how long do you think the war will last? And I said, I know you can't tell me for sure. Nobody knows. What's your best guess? And they said, the further you go to the front, to the most dangerous areas, and you speak to commanders, they will say 3 years or more. So there is a willingness to fight for the long haul. The other side of that is that so much of the country has been destroyed. Churches, sewer systems, schools, clinics, water canals, just about anything you can think of that people need to resume their daily life has been destroyed. So the resettlement of IDPs and refugees and the reconstruction is going to be a huge problem. One thing I heard that I'm skeptical of, I asked, well, who's going to pay for this? Especially because the EU is now in deep trouble economically. And one answer I got was, well, foreign investment. I have to say I'm a little skeptical about this because I don't know many foreign investors who are going to invest in rebuilding bridges and sewer systems and schools and so on. But that's a problem that they are aware of. But at the moment, they're fighting the war and they're not focused on, well, what will happen after the war is waged. So that's just a quick kind of, as they say in English, a potted summary of where I was and what I did and what I saw. And Alex, I'm happy to
Let me ask you this, Raj. Based on your experiences, I mean, did you change your opinions or your beliefs about anything regarding the war, regarding Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I did. This is a war that really has confounded all expectations, and Alex and I have talked about this very, very often. In the beginning, people thought the Russians couldn't possibly be mad enough to invade Europe's largest country in land area, right? It's a country about the size of the American state of Texas, 44 million people. This is not Georgia or Moldova. This is a huge country. So it just seemed crazy. And the belief was Putin is going to build up forces and then he's going to put pressure on the Ukrainians and the Americans. He's going to say, well, I want a deal where Ukraine doesn't enter NATO. So there was that surprise. The second surprise is how quickly they came and how quickly they were pushed back from Kiev and how long the war has lasted. If you'd asked me at the beginning, would we be in the 6 months plus of the war? I would have been very, very surprised. The losses that the Russians have taken. So what did I find that's surprising? There's kind of a paradox. The Ukrainian position seems to be that the longer the war lasts and the more there is suffering demanded by soldiers, that is, the more troops that are killed and wounded, not that they want that to happen, the more the advantage actually works to Ukraine. I said, well, why do you think that? And they said there's a very simple reason. We are defending our homeland from occupation. So there's a wellspring of nationalism and a belief that if we don't fight, we will literally lose the country. Russian soldiers cannot possibly feel that. They are not defending their homeland. This is not the great patriotic war against Hitler. And so the stakes, the willingness to fight and die, is much greater on the Ukrainian side. And I thought about that for a moment. And I remembered a conversation that an American general had at the end of the Vietnam War with a Vietnamese commander. And the general said to the Vietnamese commander, you know, the United States didn't suffer a military defeat. We were never, ever defeated by the North Vietnamese army. And his North Vietnamese interlocutor or conversationalist said to him, you entirely missed the point. Our purpose was simply to show that we are prepared to die in larger numbers and that you will ultimately decide that you cannot do that because there's that's not much at stake for you. So when you hear about Ukrainian losses and the destruction, it's all very terrible and we wish it weren't happening. But the belief is that in the long run, this is a war of attrition that'll go on for a long time, and morale, which you can't measure, right? We all made the mistake of saying, okay, let's think about things we can measure, number of tanks, number of artillery tubes, number of soldiers. But this is an intangible, fuzzy thing. You know, how long are people willing to fight and to believe in the cause? So I changed my mind in that respect. There's a second way in which I changed my mind. I wondered, what is the Ukrainian strategy? And what I was told was, look, those of you in the West who are expecting a combined arms offensive by Ukraine, that is, on the ground, tanks and armored personnel carriers, massive artillery barrages, aircraft overhead, pushing and grabbing large amounts of terrain, completely misunderstand the war we're fighting. Our goal is to slowly grind the Russians down so they believe they can't. There is no path to victory. In addition, operations of sabotage behind the front lines, the assassination of collaborators, a whole complex of things. And so I thought to myself, this is not going to be the kind of war that Clausewitz, the great Prussian military strategist, talked about. It's going to be something more like what Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist, talked about. That is surprise, deception, persistence, doing things that the adversary does not expect you to do. So those were the main things. One final thing. This is not a surprise. I remember being in a gas station, and there was a place to sit down and have coffee. And this friend I was with had arranged for some Ukrainian soldiers who were kind of special forces people who go behind the lines to do various things that we're not supposed to know about. What I found was that the morale of the armed forces is very high. There have been very few desertions. And the commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, is almost like a god. So there's an enormous belief in him and in the war. One of the worries that is, I think, evident among the soldiers I talked to is that Zaluzhny is so highly regarded that he might be moved up to be Minister of Defense, and they think that he should absolutely stay as commander-in-chief because he is the architect of this war. I think after a while, it'll be kind of strange for American military advisors to come and advise Ukrainians because they've learned a lot in fighting this war and they have their own way of fighting it. And it may be time for us to realize that, there may be a limit to what we can tell them because they've got their own way. They've figured out a way of fighting this war that minimizes their weaknesses and maximizes their strengths. They know the weaknesses and strengths very, very well. So that's, I don't know how surprising you found that, Alex, but for me, it was enlightening anyway.
I think what you mentioned, the tactical approaches that the Ukrainians have adopted, deception, persistence, grinding away. I think we're seeing that taking place at the moment on the western bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast. So on the one hand, the Ukrainians have been announcing for months that there was going to be a general, major, huge counteroffensive. Then they said, well, it might take a little later, it might be a little earlier. And then while saying that there is no counteroffensive, they actually embark on, quote, counteroffensive operations on 3 parts of those occupied territories. And again, either they don't know what they're doing, or alternatively, this is part of a plan to deceive, confuse, and the rest. And I'm more inclined to think it's the second option. Also, this grinding down business, you see this in this part of Ukraine as well. For reasons that escape me, the Russians rushed thousands of troops to that area west of the Dnipro. The Ukrainians, realizing that they could actually cut these troops off from the mainland, have now destroyed the bridges linking Kherson west with Kherson east. And at this point in time, somewhere between 20 and 25,000 Russian troops are effectively encircled. I mean, that is to say, they've got the river to their backs. At that point, it's about a mile long across, so it's not easy to, they'd have to be very good swimmers to cross and escape. And the strategy seems to be not to engage in any kind of frontal assault, but to kind of pick and choose your battles, focus on weak spots, gain a village, gain two steps forward, 1 step backward, but just kind of grind away and see what happens. And of course, in Kherson, the ultimate goal is the destruction and or imprisonment of over 20,000 Russian soldiers. I mean, if something like that were to occur, or even if something half that huge were to occur, I mean, that would be a shock to the system. Certainly to the Russian system and to the legitimacy and popularity of Putin. What's interesting to me is that I've been recently following some of the crazy statements by one of Russia's key propagandists, Vladimir Solovyov. And in the statement that he said yesterday, he said explicitly that he feels concern. He feels concern about what's going on in Kherson. Now, this is a man who just recently called Joseph Borrell a fascist. This is a man who spares no criticism, is willing to use every possible insult. And for him to actually state in a relatively moderate tone of voice that he is concerned suggests to me that there is concern that extends beyond his television studio and extends into perhaps the Kremlin as well.
Yeah, it's not just him, by the way. A whole series of Russians on the far right have been frustrated by what they expected versus what they're seeing. And the criticism is never aimed at Vladimir Putin for obvious reasons, but it's trained increasingly on Sergei Shoigu, who apparently has been the defense minister, who apparently has been kind of marginalized already. It'll be very interesting to see if he keeps his job. If he doesn't keep his job, despite all the bravado, it's a clear sign that the Russians believe that something bad is happening. On the Russian troops on the right bank or the west bank, depending on how you define it, of the Dnipro, a lot of these bridges have been destroyed. Bridges can be repaired in wartime, but if you're constantly facing attacks on the bridges, you can't supply your troops. Now, you can supply them with pontoon bridges and ferries, but if you cross on pontoon bridges and ferries, you're open to fire in a much more dramatic way. So it's very dangerous, and you can't get the volume of goods across. So another marker will be how much by way of supplies do Russian forces on the right/west bank of the Dnipro have, and will they have to give up the first big major city that they captured in that area? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm watching very, very carefully because there's a supply problem. It's a particular problem because right from the beginning of the war, one of the things that surprised me is, Napoleon said an army marches on its stomach, which means that an army can only fight if you deliver food and medicine and all these things that are not like tanks and rocket-propelled grenades. Not that Napoleon had any of that. The supply problem has been very bad from the beginning. So the logistics are the Achilles heel, the weakness of the Russian army. It's pretty clear. And so the question is, if they face logistical problems when they're connected to Ukraine by land, that is in the Donbass sector, how much harder is it going to be to do something like this across the river? One other thing, Alex, you asked me what surprised me. Not a surprise, but I want to share this with you and the others who are here. There's been a lot of talk here about, will Putin, if he's desperate, use nuclear weapons? And there's a kind of twofold view among Ukrainians. It's not entirely consistent. One is he's unpredictable, he's crazy. This is not just about Ukraine, it's about all of Europe. On the other hand, he's weak, he's desperate, and he's going to never use nuclear weapons because he knows that will be a disaster. But at the end of the day, their position is this. The more you harp on escalation and the dangers of escalation, and the more that becomes part of the conversation of the West, it works entirely to the advantage of Putin, because the subtext or the unwritten words in that line of argument is, oh my gosh, we could be heading toward Armageddon, and we have to therefore settle and make a deal with Putin. So they're a little, shall we say, mildly irritated about all the fuss that they think is being made about escalation, because they think it sends exactly the wrong message to Moscow. Now, I'm not saying, therefore, we shouldn't be worried about it, but I'm just giving you, I went there certainly not to tell the Ukrainians anything I knew, because they know much more than I, but I wanted to get a sense of what do they think? What is it like there? What do I need to know? So everyone I talked to, I said, what is it that I need to know? And what is it you think the West doesn't understand? That was my question to every person I met. I didn't speak very much. I just listened. And so this is some of the things that I picked up.
You just asked a very important question. So what is it that the West doesn't understand?
Well, you know, Al,
I mean, both in terms of what they believe and in terms of what you now believe, having been there and based on your own work and research.
Right. You know as well as I do that the Western analytical community, composed of people who know Ukraine very well. By the way, Ukraine is also a little contemptuous of people who are holding forth about their country who couldn't name 3 cities in Ukraine or don't know anything about the history of Ukraine. I think they have very little patience for that. And I'm with that. I'm all in favor of theory, but I think you require, you have to have the humility to read something about this country of which you have so many strong opinions, right? For example, I keep hearing, oh, it's Western Ukraine, it's Eastern Ukraine. I think those differences have just been largely dissolved. The so-called Russophone regions of Ukraine, the East and the South, have been among the hardest hit. I mean, the paradox is that Putin says, well, I'm coming to rescue my fellow Russian brothers and sisters, but they're the ones, look at Mariupol, for example, who've taken the hardest hit. And I met many Russian speakers who said to me that they are finished with Russia and that the younger people who are Russian speakers are gradually going to move toward Ukrainian, adopting Ukraine as the language in which they speak. We'll talk about language policy later on. So I think that the view is that there's not really a very good grasp here. Now, the Western community, Alex, you mentioned that. It's divided, right? So you have on the one hand, people who say, well, NATO expansion caused all of this, and now you have to do something to end the war. You have to have a political settlement in Europe. Say that's John Mearsham. Then you have Timothy Snyder of Yale, who says it's got nothing to do with the NATO expansion. It's in the Russian DNA to be expansionist, and what we're seeing is just the age-old repetition of Russian expansion. There isn't one Russian position, but if you ask me which position do the Ukrainians like better, they certainly like the Snyder position better because they don't think that fundamentally this is about NATO expansion. I mean, I have a somewhat more complicated view of this, but they think it's about something much more different. That is the inability of Putin to accept that Ukraine is an independent country. It's just that simple in their view. That's what this is all about.
And of course, but it also goes beyond Putin. It's the inability of the Russian elites, and it's the inability of a substantial segment of the Russian population,
right?
To accept the reality of a Ukrainian nation and state.
Point, one thing I found is that there's a focus on Putin, but increasingly what I was told was this is not just about one person. He's reflective of much deeper forces in Russian society, and a person, and I said to this person, but isn't that stereotyping an entire group of people, saying they all share this imperial mentality? And she looked at me in kind of mock surprise and said, you were just in Bucha and Hostomel. You saw the things that had happened. Russian soldiers were defecated in homes. And I'm not saying in the bathroom, but in the living room, with the bedrooms, atrocious things. Can you really tell me that normal people conduct this kind of war? So there is a kind of an irrevocable break, I think, with Russia, and enormous hatred and antipathy. And it is not, as people say here, limited to Western Ukraine, the so-called anti-Russian batch. And I think that's way oversimplified. I don't know if you'd agree with me about that, Alex.
No, I agree with you completely. Yeah. And all the more so, I mean, in effect, what Putin has done is let me use the word forced. He's forced all Ukrainians to be Ukrainian and to detest the Russians. I mean, even though a substantial portion of them had no interest in detesting Russians, and public opinion polls have shown over the last 30 years that roughly 80–90% of Ukrainians have, throughout that entire period, had positive attitude towards Russians. That's changed. It's a sea change, right? It used to be 90, now it's about 10%, maybe even less.
When the history books are written about Ukraine and the war, and 20 years from now, when we're no longer around, or at least Alex and I won't be around 30 years from now, alongside people like Skoropadsky and Khmelnytsky and others who contributed to the formation of Ukraine as a state, will be Vladimir Putin, because he's in a sense been the biggest, not the biggest, but one of the biggest boosters of Ukrainian nationalism. So here's what's happened. Here's why this is a strategic failure. Ukraine, everybody can, I think, here accept that in his eyes is the most important of the former Soviet republics that became independent. There's no state that's more important, right? Not the Baltics, not Belarus. Ukraine has a special resonance. Well, the war has meant that there's an irrevocable breach now between Ukraine and Russia. And so that is a strategic failure. The expansion of NATO to include Finland and Sweden is a strategic failure. The decision now to overlook the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act and to deploy troops, NATO troops permanently in the eastern flank, that's a strategic failure. So I don't see how at the end of this will be seen as some grand strategic maneuver by Putin that proved to be brilliant. One other point, we all know now increasingly that there are manpower problems. So they've raised the military age in Russia eligibility to 59. Can you imagine 59?
Hey, you and I might almost qualify. If we dye our hair, we could actually join up.
Yeah, I'll take you with me back to Melitopol.
Nikopol.
There I go again. Maybe I should have visited Melitopol. And then there's a report that homeless shelters are now being sort of cased to get homeless people to share in the Russian army. Putin has not declared conscription, even though he says this is an existential threat to Russia. This war has to be won. The Ukrainians have conscription. If you're a young man, unless you have a very good reason and you're a military age, you can't leave the country. So they have a reservoir to work on. One point on Kherson, Alex, I'm a little worried about what I see. One of the people I talked to there, who's an American, said to me, I think they're going to have to do something in Kherson because the UN General Assembly session is coming up. The Europeans are never, the Ukrainians, by the way, don't trust the Europeans. Britain aside, and the Poles and the Balts aside, they don't really trust France and Germany in particular. But the argument that was made to me was they have to show that they're not only capable of continuing to fight, but they are capable of showing successes so that Ukraine is seen as a horse worth betting on, if I can use a measure. But I just read a report on the Washington Post that says there have been successes in Kherson, in Kharkiv, or north of Kharkiv, and parts of Donetsk. And it is true that the Russian army, since the fall of Lysychansk in July, hasn't really made any significant gains. But the casualties that the Ukrainians have taken in the Kherson operation have been really very high. And it's not surprising because for every artillery shell they fire, the Russians can fire 10 back. And they have just much more firepower. So the question is, when the gains are made and it's been demonstrated that Ukraine can continue to fight, what will be the human toll? We don't have the casualty numbers, but I think it will show that the casualties that they've taken for this operation are very, very high. I'm not saying that therefore they shouldn't have done it. They have their own reasons for doing it, but I don't think it's going to be an easy thing.
That's an interesting point. I mean, one of the Ukrainian generals about a week or two ago, this is, of course, before these counteroffensive operations, but nevertheless, he said that Ukrainian losses amounted to about 9,000. That is to say, killed. And of course, as you know, the Ukrainian estimates of Russian losses are about 50,000 at this point in time. Both numbers are probably off to some degree. But whatever the number is, I mean, I know at the height of the battles over Lysychansk, the Ukrainians were losing up to 200 a day. Now, the Russians apparently were losing something like 300 to 400 a day, but be that as it may, that was certainly a depletion on Ukrainian manpower. I don't know if the numbers are that high in Kherson. From the reports that I've been reading, and again, these are civilians or former military people who don't necessarily have access to the most up-to-date secret information, but they are not presenting the fighting as being all that costly in terms of manpower. Now, again, it may simply be a belief on their part that such things are better not discussed. I don't know, but we'll certainly find out within a few weeks, I suspect.
The story, and this is one story, and you should all read it and make up your own minds. It is a visit to a military hospital, and there are some very graphic pictures of wounded Ukrainian soldiers, some of them very badly wounded. But then there are conversations with them. And the theme that runs through the conversations is not, it's so bad that we have to stop fighting. They want to keep fighting, but they say the balance of firepower, that is how much the Russians have to throw at the Ukrainians in terms of just artillery shells and airstrikes and so on, is so phenomenal that the casualties have been very, very high. And you should read the piece. I don't know what the actual numbers are. We won't know for some time. Ukraine has been very careful in guarding its casualty rates. I don't blame it for doing that. That's exactly what one would expect them to do. But I don't think any of this, there's kind of a danger, I think, on the one hand, you have to worry about Western support and to show that Ukraine is still capable of fighting. On the other hand, you want to be aware that you're dealing with an adversary that has got a lot of firepower, and the offensive always takes much bigger casualties than the defensive, and the Russians are behind protected line. So I'm not in a position to say whether Kherson should have been waged and whether it was a success, but the sense I get is that over time we'll learn that the casualties are fairly high. But the very fact that it was launched itself is surprising, because even the Russian media has now begun to acknowledge that there have been certain areas in which the Ukrainians have made breakthroughs. But opinion here is very divided. I just talked to a friend of mine the other day who said, this is all mainstream media and Ukrainian hype. The Russians are going to eventually just destroy the Ukrainians. So Western opinion is very divided. But I think the Ukrainians don't care about, frankly, what academics like me think on whether on one side or the other. They're focused on the Biden administration. And their reading is quite correct. There's no evidence that Biden is willing to abandon Ukraine. There's no evidence that he's facing any pressure from the Congress, whether Republicans or Democrats, to do that. And there's no sign that people are on the streets calling for the end of the war. So in that respect, they're quite in pretty good shape. And the game in town for them is not Britain or France or Poland or the Baltic states. No matter how supportive they've been, they don't have the weaponry. It's the US.
It's the US, of course.
As the war goes on for many, many years, can the supply be maintained? And if Ukraine cannot pay for these supplies, will the supplies be given? And what if at that point the American economy begins to experience serious difficulties? Will the mood change? I have no idea, but it's just a scenario that we should think about. I don't know what's going to happen. One of the things I've learned about this war is to never engage in any predictions. People are going to ask me, well, who's going to win and when is it going to be over? And I say, I haven't the faintest idea. I had more firm beliefs about this before I went than when I came back, because I frankly am more confused than I was before I went about this war. It's been a very sobering and enlightening experience, I have to say.
Well, two of the things that the Ukrainians have been doing well, this is aside from the counteroffensive operations that may or may not be taking place and so on. But one is the decision that was adopted at least a month ago to target ammunition dumps, supplied depots communication centers and so on. And I think, I started counting these about a month and a half ago. And then at some point when it got to 50, I just gave up because they were destroying 2 to 3 a day. And I believe the number at this point is probably close to 100. So whatever the exact number is, but it's certainly very high. And it's obviously having some kind of impact on the amount, on the kind of ammunition the Russians have in general, but especially in the key sectors such as Kherson, Donbass, and so on.
Right.
And then the other thing that they're doing, which you mentioned as well, is the partisans, some of which are probably special forces in disguise, many of which are probably locals. But they've really taken hold. I've been following them fairly closely. And there's roughly a violent incident per day, every day in the course of a month. Now, sometimes it's 2 a day, sometimes it's 1 in 2 days, but it's roughly that kind of average. And as you mentioned, they're targeting collaborators, which is certainly putting the fear of God into people with those inclinations. And what's striking to me is that initially the kinds of resistance incidents that one encountered were primarily, not exclusively, but primarily symbolic: graffiti, raising the flag, distributing leaflets, and so on. Violent incidents were a distinct minority. Now the violent incidents, and especially the violent incidents directed at people, have risen. Again, not exactly exponentially, but they are now way in the majority. So something is obviously going on. And my guess is that this is being coordinated with whatever the army seems to be doing in Kherson Oblast.
Right.
But that's just a guess.
This is not going to, well, I was told this is not going to be a Clausewitz kind of war, like a World War II kind of war, but it'll be this war of attrition where constantly, in addition to fighting at the front, there are things going on in the rear. Multiple strikes, by the way, in Crimea. People say, well, Ukrainians won't touch Russian territory because Americans won't allow them to. Well, they hit Crimea, which is not Russian territory, but seen by Russians as Russian territory. So the whole idea is to keep the adversary off balance, confused. And when you hit ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and command and control centers, those are the nerve centers for a military to wage a war. And so you may not be destroying large numbers of tanks and aircraft, but you're taking away the ability of the military to see and to control and to communicate. So those are not minor developments, I think.
Exactly. Now, Raj, we've got about 10 minutes left. And as I promised our vast audience, we will return to the question that you raised at our last meeting, namely the fact that it was probably a mistake for Ukraine, perhaps an inevitable mistake, but a mistake nonetheless, to have given up nuclear weapons in 1994. The implication being that Ukraine today would have been better off had it possessed a nuclear deterrent. Could you pursue that?
Yeah.
And what are some of the policy implications for Ukraine? Should it acquire or try to acquire nuclear weapons?
Yeah. I have a larger view of this that I've held for some time, and that is that if you look at everyone talks about the importance of nuclear proliferation and how important it is that other countries not get nuclear weapons because either they're not mature enough to handle them or they're too crazy or whatever. But it's very interesting. If you look at the members, the permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, what do they all have in common? They all have nuclear weapons. So what message does that send to other countries? If you want to be a great power and be taken seriously, right, you might want to have nuclear weapons, which is partly why India got them, Pakistan got them, maybe the Iranians are trying, North Korea has gotten them, that's one thing. So there's a kind of a nuclear apartheid, right? The countries that have nuclear weapons worry about nuclear proliferation, don't want anyone else to get them, but they're perfectly happy to have tens or thousands or hundreds of tens or many thousands of nuclear weapons themselves, and they are not about to give them up. So there's a kind of a two-tier rule. So in the 90s, when the discussion was taking place of what to do with the nuclear weapons in Belarus and in Ukraine that were deployed there when they were part of the Soviet Union, a deal was done in which those weapons were removed from Ukraine and Belarus. Now, I understand why Ukraine did it at the time, but I was not in favor of it even at the time. I was not in favor of it, not because I thought there would be a Russian invasion. I didn't predict a Russian invasion. But I wasn't sure that it was not worth having nuclear weapons as a kind of guarantee. What I'm waiting to see, and I think it'll be very delicate because there will be no support in the West for the Ukrainian nuclear option, it's certainly not from Russia, is whether there will be a revival within Ukraine about, especially if they don't get into NATO, about whether, as the ultimate security guarantee, they need to have nuclear weapons. I would be surprised if they went ahead and did that against Western opinion, but I do think in retrospect that it was a mistake to give up nuclear weapons, although I understand it, because at the end of the day, and Ukrainians understand this very well, everybody can supply you with weapons and cheer you from the sidelines, but no one's going to care about the defense of your country more than you do. And so that is the world in which we live. And so that's why I've been somebody who has not been a kind of pro-proliferationist across the board. Let's take India, for example. I completely understand why the Indians got nuclear weapons. Who's sitting on their northern borders? China. If India is invaded by China and China takes large amounts of territory, is the United States going to come and intervene and fight a war with China? Of course not. Which is why the Indians have nuclear weapons. Now, the Pakistanis have nuclear weapons because India has nuclear weapons, and so it goes. So can a case be made that Ukraine, which it's been demonstrated has just faced a major invasion, doesn't have any threat that would justify at least thinking about acquiring a minimum nuclear deterrent? Because it is not credible to threaten to use nuclear weapons willy-nilly, but it is certainly credible to threaten to use them against a country that has invaded your territory. And you don't need very many to raise the cost for an invader. Now, everybody's going to hate me after I've said this. So don't write about it, don't speak about it, because I don't think this is a very popular view, but it happens to be my view.
An important view, and it needs to be discussed. And I suspect it is being discussed by certain elements within the Ukrainian political and military establishment. It makes perfect sense. Of course, there's always the fear that if the Ukrainians start a program of some sort, the Russians will retaliate, perhaps strike first, and that could set off a kind of escalatory spiral, but who knows? Who knows? I had one question that was asked by a friend of mine, Alexander Gendler of Chicago. He had to leave. It's a very specific one, and this is, could you specify the shelter staffed by young, bright people in Dnipro? What is the name of it, and maybe the phone number and email? Do you have those coordinates?
I'll send it to you.
I'll pass it on to him then.
I don't have it handy, but I will send it to you, and certainly the friend that I went with has it.
Okay.
I will say that certain relief agencies, by the way, you don't see much of a big presence by USAID. It's all subcontracted to local charities. You don't see a huge presence of the UN World Food Program, although in one instance I did in this shelter. Lots of the NGO activity is done by Ukrainian NGOs, but one place that is very active and to which I have given money because I know they're active is World Central Kitchen. They're doing enormously good work in providing food to IDPs and refugees. So if you want to support a charity, World Central Kitchen is a good place, and they have a website. I'll get you the women's shelter. The women's shelter, by the way, is a small space. There are bunk beds that look like someone like me with no carpentry skills built them, and people have put sheets down to have some minimal privacy. But as hard as the living conditions are there, they are in a place where they don't have to worry about being killed.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not a problem.
And that's a nice thought to end on. Rajan Menon, I thank you very much. Our audience, There seem to be 35 who have still managed to listen to us, and they're still on Zoom. So thank you as all for participating. And we hope to see you again in about a month or so when we have our 5th conversation about a topic to be determined, presumably something dealing with the war in Ukraine, of course. Thank you very much, everybody. Pardon?
Next time I'm going to interview you.
Yes, okay. Thank you all very much. And thanks again to the Ukrainian Free University for sponsoring this event. And see you in about a month.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
all. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you.